joys and woes, all our pleasure, all our melody.
Make us each a channel of thy peace. When in darkness, guide us from above. Where there's sorrow, may we sow thy joy. Where there's hatred, may we share thy love. Lord most high, our heavenly Father, all our lives we dedicate to thee. All our labors, all our joys and woes, all our pleasure, all our melody. Make us each a channel of thy peace. When in darkness, guide us from above. Where there's sorrow, may we sow thy joy. Where there's hatred, may we share thy love.
Enough. Good morning. Our reading today is taken from the Rays of the One Light, weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. Who are true Christians? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Jesus Christ said in chapter 10 of the Gospel of St. John, "All that have ever come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them." Many Christians, not surprisingly, quote this saying in condemnation of other spiritual teachers, not only the Old Testament prophets, but also Buddha, Krishna, and others who lived before Jesus, as well as by inference any who came after him. Yet Jesus himself said in St. Matthew chapter 5, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Nowhere do we find Jesus condemning or even gently criticizing other spiritual masters. His criticisms are reserved for worldly attitudes and for those hypocritical Pharisees who had allowed religion to become, for them, a pretense. Paramahansa Yogananda explained that the expression, "all that ever came before me," referred to those spiritual teachers who placed their egos and their self-importance ahead of the Christ consciousness, in the sense of drawing people's devotion to themselves and not offering it where it alone truly belongs, to God. Yogananda himself was very firm in this regard. For example, he never spoke of anyone as his disciple. Instead, he always insisted, "They are God's disciples. God is the guru, not I." Ego is a way station on the soul's journey toward enlightenment. The soul is first trapped in lower bodily forms. Slowly it evolves to the human level, at which point self-consciousness appears. Only in human form can self-consciousness transcend material form altogether, including the lower identity of ego consciousness, and discover the true divine self within. Self-consciousness manifested as ego is an incentive to deliberate self-development. Later in this process of development, however, the ego becomes an obstruction. Inevitably, new spiritual aspirants do not emerge effortlessly from the vortex of ego consciousness. Desire must be offered up resolutely and ever more wholeheartedly on the altar of infinity. It is a gradual process, and few, even among those who seek to help others, are free of ego. If, however, their motive in teaching is not to serve, but to be served, they deserve a severe reprimand as Jesus gave them. for their direction of development is no longer upward, but downward. In the name of giving up desire, they are creating new ones, as it says in the Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter. Desire obscures even the wisdom of the wise. Their relentless foe it is, a flame never quenched. Intellect, mind, and senses, these combined are referred to as the seat of desire. Desire, through them, deludes and eclipses the discrimination of the embodied soul. O Arjuna, discipline your senses, and having done so, work to destroy desire, annihilator of wisdom and of self-realization. Give God credit for everything you do. See him as the doer. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind.
Good morning, everyone. How is everybody today?
Awake and ready.
Yay. Thank you, everyone, for coming and joining us this morning. For those of you who don't know us, my name is Nayaswami Gangamata. This is my husband, Nayaswami Daiva, and it's our joy to be here together. Our topic this morning, who are the true Christians, reminded me of the story of the little boy that was walking along a beach one day when he spots this matronly woman sitting on a blanket, and he goes up to her and he says, "Are you a Christian?" And she says, "Well, yes, I am." And he says, "Well then, will you hold my quarter while I go swimming?" Let's begin with a reading from Whispers from Eternity. And this is number 201. I vow never again to turn my gaze from thee. I take this sacred vow, never will I lower my love's gaze below the eyebrow horizon of my constant thoughts of thee. Never will I turn my uplifted inner sight away from thee. Never will I let my mind dwell on anything that reminds me not of thee. I will disdain the nightmare of ignorant behavior. I will court all dreams of noble achievement, those of love, kindness, and understanding, for they are thy dreams. Though I dream many dreams, wakefully I will ever think of thee. In the sacred fire of constant remembrance, keep ever a light on my soul's altar. I will ever behold thy presence with the watchful eyes of devotional love. Thy graces show me that the dualities of health and sickness, life and death, joy and sorrow are but passing fantasies. I am finished with those eternally self-canceling delusions. I am persuaded at last that there is but one abiding reality, thy eternal, ever conscious, ever new, ever thrilling, infinite bliss. Om, peace, amen. Our topic on inspiration, thank you, reminds me of the story of Swami Kriyananda. Many years ago, it was during Spiritual Renewal Week at Ananda Village, and we mentioned that last week. We were there, a couple of weeks ago. Spiritual Renewal Week, if you missed last week's service, is a highlight at Ananda Village. It's a week of classes and inspiration, and it's literally what the title says, Spiritual Renewal Week. Well, this one year, Swami Kriyananda did all of Spiritual Renewal Week. He gave all of the morning talks. There's talks Monday through Saturday, so he gave all of them. And then there's always afternoon workshops. And he gave all of those workshops on whatever the topic was. And then there were evening events, a concert, a play, or whatever it was, very many inspiring events. He did all of those also. And you can imagine Swami Kriyananda, for those who don't know, he's the founder of Ananda. He was a direct disciple of Yogananda. He's no longer with us. But you can imagine it was a deeply inspiring week. So somebody went up to him at the end of Spiritual Renewal Week and he says, "How do we keep the inspiration going?" And he said 2 simple words. He said, "We meditate." And then a friend went on to add to that, if we can dedicate ourselves more deeply to our spiritual practices, then we'll find that true and everlasting inspiration. So if we have a meditation practice, making that commitment, dedicating ourselves to taking it deeper. Yogananda said, in every meditation we should go deeper than the last. But then also if we don't have a practice, making a commitment to start one wherever we are, not feeling guilty about where we are or what we can or we can't do. I've told the story of myself having come from New York City to the West Coast, learning all of a sudden this concept of meditation. How do you meditate when you come from New York City, when you pride yourself on how many things you can do at the same time? But I was really blessed because I had a wonderful teacher. He said, okay, can you give me 5 minutes twice a day? And I said, I think I can do that. 5 minutes, that won't take up too much of my time, and I can still do all the other things. But fortunately, he helped me to start where I was, and that's what it's about, starting where we are. And then we find that true inspiration. And we find, as we dedicate ourselves to a regular practice of meditation, our spiritual practices, we see that meditation is not just the time that we spend in front of the altar, though that is a very sacred time. But we find that it begins to affect us in our everyday life, begins to affect us how we talk, right? We find that maybe we're speaking kinder words, maybe we're speaking more softly. How we walk, maybe we're walking with our shoulders back and leading with our heart. What we're doing at work, at home, we find that it affects every part of our life. And then the more, again, that we meditate, the more that we can find that true inspiration, which is what? That joy, love, kindness. And then we see that all these things are a product of that inspiration. Work is joy. Being at home is joy. Being with our friends, our family, all the duties that we're doing. We see that it's all made in the same image. A little girl was sitting next to her grandfather as he was reading her a bedtime story. And she would look up at him, and then she would just pause for a moment, and then she took her little finger and ran it down his wrinkled cheek. And then she took her little finger and ran it down her cheek. And then she looked up at him and did the same thing. And then she thought for a moment, and she asked her grandfather, Grandpa, did God make you? And he said, oh, yes, honey, Grandpa made me, but a very long time ago. And she thought about that for a minute. And she said, well, did God make me too? And Grandpa said, oh, yes, but he made you just a little while ago. And she thought about that. And she said, he's getting better at it, isn't he? We can be so hard on ourselves, right? If we didn't meditate one morning, or I just can't get the energization right, or I just can't do this, and we forget how close we are. And Yogananda saying to a disciple of his, it takes very, very, very good karma to even want to know God. It takes very, very good karma even to be here this morning. But we forget and we look at our flaws or what we think are our greatnesses. I love the story of the water bearer who was, every morning he would go down to the river to fill his pots. And he had 2 pots, one on each end. And one pot was beautiful. Just beautiful color and perfect and no imperfections, so-called imperfections on it. But the other one had a crack in it, right? And so one day he was down at the water, he was filling these 2 pots, and you can just guess what would happen. By the time he would bring it back to his house, the one pot with the crack in it would always come back half empty. And this really distressed the pot with the crack in it. So one day when the water bearer was at the river, the pot with a crack in it just shared his despair with the water bearer. He goes, I feel so bad. I have this horrible crack in my pot, and every time you get back, it's half filled with water. And the water bearer looked at him like, what are you talking about? Haven't you noticed? Haven't you noticed all the beautiful flowers that are on your side? Every time I walk back up to the house, what has been happening? I knew you had that crack. And then, so I planted these flowers, and there's these gorgeous flowers. In the last 2 years, I've been enjoying the beauty because of who you are and the way you're made. And we forget that. We forget just the way that we're made. We're made in God's image. And this reading this morning has so many levels to it. It's just a beautiful reading, the reminder of that we are all made in His image. I love the story of Frank Laubach. He was a Christian missionary, and he was in the Philippines, and he started many, many schools. And when he arrived there, he realized, his example is not going to be by his words, but by his actions and how he's going to live in each moment. And so he was out on a boat when another neighboring boat came by, and they were saying this prayer. And the priest on that boat called over to Frank. He said, "Will you pray with us?" And Frank said, "Sure, yes, of course." And the priest in that boat said, "Are you Islam?" And Frank said, "No, but I'm a friend." And so together they ended up praying. Together we're all praying together, all created in that same image. I was remembering this topic also reminds me of the time that we had the blessing to go on pilgrimage to Israel. And one of the highlights was being in Jerusalem and the spot where Christ first said the Lord's Prayer. The church, I think, is called the Pater Nostra. I look over at David Eby, were on the trip with us. It's really powerful. And you walk in, it's just this beautiful big cathedral, as often happens, the spot where something sacred happens, this beautiful cathedral is built around it. And as we started walking around, because it had many wings to it, you could see the Lord's Prayer on these big ceramic pieces. And they were written in different languages. And it just went on and on and on. And there were all the ones that Italy, France, of course, but then there were even more obscure ones like Croatia. I was really happy to see that, or Serbia. My parents are from that part. But the Lord's Prayer then was written in over like 140 languages. I looked that up on the internet. God bless the internet. You can look things up. But then it was so sweet. I don't know if you remember, but our guide was from Israel, and we stopped in front of a plaque that was written in Arabic. And then he knew Arabic, so he said the prayer to us in Arabic. And what was it? Aramaic, Aramaic. It was so sweet. It really, and then to be there and see all these different nationalities come, you realize really we're all made in the same image. And Israel's really fun because it's a small country. It's a beautiful country. It's a fifth the size of Oregon, or the size of New Jersey, for those of you who are from back east. And they have a funny saying where the mountains are hills in Israel, everything's much smaller. Where the mountains are really hills, and where the seas are really like lakes, And I was raised Catholic, it's so many stories of Christ, and being there and walking where that Christ walked. You could feel his presence very deeply. And many of the stories were coming back, especially when we were near the Sea of Galilee. There's just many stories when Jesus is in his boat and he's sailing on the Sea of Galilee. And then you read that the disciples were following him along the water. Well, how could that be if it's a sea? Well, it's really more like a lake. But it was really beautiful. We were at this spot where Christ asked Peter 3 times, the betrayal had happened, "Do you love me?" And then he asked him again, "Do you love me?" And then again, one more time, here is a master asking Peter, "Do you love me?" Isn't that symbolic? The masters don't need anything from us but our love. They ask us, "Do you love me?" And then what does Peter say? As we know, the beautiful words, "Ah, yes, my Lord," just washing away that karma, washing that all away. It's all about that love. What is it? Love, it said in our reading, love is what nourishes true inspiration. And I looked up the definition of inspiration. Again, thank God for the internet. What would we have done? The second definition, it said the drawing in of breath, inhalation. That's inspiration, the drawing in of breath, the drawing in of life force, of vitality, of God, of spirit, of love, of all those qualities of spirit. So another... when it was so towards the end of Yogananda's life, a disciple of Yogananda's asked him, he said, "Sir, what will happen when you're gone?" And Yogananda said so sweetly, "Only love can take my place. Only love." Of all the things that he picked, right? It's love. And there's a beautiful story, Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. If you open it up, he dedicated it to Luther Burbank, who he called an American saint. And Luther Burbank, I had the blessing also to visit his home in Santa Rosa, California. But he had a spineless cactus that he grew. And he just told it, he said, "You have He said, you have nothing to fear. You don't need your defensive thorns. I will protect you. And Yogananda went and visited Luther Burbank's home in Santa Rosa, and he saw this, and he was just so touched by it that he got a clipping of it, and he started the cactus in Los Angeles, and it didn't have any spines on it for the rest of Yogananda's life. But after he passed, a couple of years after he passed, vandals broke into Mount Washington, and they actually, unfortunately, they hurt the cactus. And then a little time, wasn't too long after that, that it started to grow thorns again. And so the nuns, fortunately, the nuns and the brothers there, they noticed it. And so they started to pray again around this cactus, and they started to tell it, you have nothing to fear. Love is around you. And sure enough, it started to drop its thorns. A saint said a beautiful thing, if we only knew how much God loved us, if we only knew, we would die for joy. If we only knew that. And then all these things that we think are our greatnesses, our weaknesses, or the things we don't do so well, and all of that, those would all go away because we would just be in that love, in that inspiration. We would see that unity. We'd see then we're the true Christians. We're living in His love, right? It's, again, not about the outer, but about the inner. There's a simple prayer that somebody offered. Divine Mother, awaken your love within me, and then let me awaken that love in all. Let me share that inspiration, that joy with everyone we meet. I'd like to end with a reading from Swami Kriyananda. He wrote this, I don't know when he wrote this, but this is called How to Live with the Lord. Think not of what you can get, but what you can give. Serve not people, but God through people. God is happiest, not in our efficiency, but in our increasingly humble attitude. Get yourself out of the way. Don't think of yourself, but of Him. Serve joyfully, even in obscurity. Don't look to others for endorsement. Be content to seek the Lord's smile in your heart. Be centered in the inner self. Don't let circumstances or people pull you down. Let Christ's light fill you when you work with others. Be an open window through which the Lord's sunlight can flow to all. God will support you the more you live in Him. Let God radiate in your heart and live by His inner inspiration. Work more listening to God inwardly. Ask only, Lord, are you pleased? How can I please you more? And ask, dear God, tell me what you want. Help me to do what you want. You are God's child. There is nothing that is not yours. Be a radiant spirit, large, not small. Greater dignity and greater strength add nicely to your childlikeness. Be joyfully courageous, majestically confident. Be filled with confidence that the Holy Spirit will use you. The power of the infinite is in you. Live more in that center where God dwells. Radiate this to others, and their lives and your own will be changed. Peace. Amen. And we'll have some music.
And the words are adapted from Yogananda's poem, God, Christ, Guru.
Of slumber as I ascend the spiral stairway of wakefulness, I will whisper, of nightly separation from thee. I will taste thee and mentally say, spotlight of my mind will ever keep turning on thee, and in the battle din of activity, my silent war cry will be, God, God. Boisterous storms of trial shriek, and when worries howl at me, I will drown their noises, loudly chanting, God, God. Of memories, on that magic cloth will I emboss, God, in time of deepest sleep, when my peace dreams and calls joy, joy, my joy comes singing evermore. Chanting, divinely loving, my soul will constantly hum, unheard by any.